Hey there, good evening. In today's video, you're going to learn about fascinating stories from medieval knights to kings with bizarre habits, going through dark trials, Viking slavery, and children lost in the Industrial Revolution. All this narrated at a calm pace made to help you relax and fall asleep. If you're enjoying the content, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and remember to watch every night. This helps a lot for your sleep, and our work too. Enjoy your time travel in the vast hills of dotted castles in medieval Europe, where the morning fog coiled among the treetops and the castles cast their imposing shadows against the grey sky, lived Geoffrey de Montbard. A young boy who since childhood had dreamt of becoming a knight, just like his ancestors, whose shiny armor and gleaming swords held a place of prestige in the family stories told by candlelight on freezing nights. Geoffrey was born into a noble family in Anjou, France. His fate seemed sealed since birth. He would be a knight, a bastion of honor, and a defender of the highest principles of chivalry. Throughout his childhood, he spent hours with a stick, imitating swords, battling invisible enemies in the vast, flowering fields surrounding his father's castle. The metallic clang of practice swords, the shock of the shields, and the shouts of the mock battles were the soundtrack to his youth. However, as Geoffrey grew, he began to see that the tales of chivalry he knew were imbued with exaggerations and romantic myths. The reality of a knight's life, he found, was not only filled with victories and glory, but just as many hardships as he imagined, and the shadows of war were much closer than he had initially judged. The first obstacle was the armor itself. Made of heavy steel plates, a knight's full armor was a feat of medieval engineering, but also a monumental burden. Comprising dozens of pieces, each carefully molded to interlock with precision, it offered significantly more protection than chainmail used by ordinary soldiers. Even so, this protection came with costs. Geoffrey, like other young squires and knight aspirants, began his training at 14 under the tutelage of Sir Roger, a veteran knight known for his bravery, but also for being harsh in training young nobles. Sir Roger, with his tall and stern figure, cultivated an aura of respect automatically conferred by the shine of his armor, a relic polished by time and battles. The old knight had gone through innumerable campaigns, his scars evident in the corrected tales after sips of sweetened wine. One morning at sunrise, Geoffrey was summoned to join the other squires in the castle training yard. There, under the watchful eye of Sir Roger, he donned the armor for the first time. The broad protrusions of metal were strapped to his body with thick leather straps. The weight on his shoulders suddenly seemed inscrutable. Every move was laborious. Every step was calculated to not culminate in a calamitous disaster of collapsing metal. "Now fight!" ordered Sir Roger ruthlessly, handing Geoffrey the practice sword. The young man trembled under the double weight of armor and weapon, but he attacked his opponent with the courage he had left. But he soon realized how slow he was. His opponent, light and agile, dodged easily and retaliated, hitting him in quick succession. At the end of the exercise, Geoffrey could not withstand more than a few minutes before collapsing. His muscles cried out for mercy, and his pride was as battered as the greaves of his armor. Even without the weight of armor, the life of a knight was hard. Geoffrey found himself living in a constant vigil. A knight's duties were endless. Beyond continuous martial training, he had to oscillate between the aristocratic court, where he was supposed to hone his social skills, and the battlefield, where he faced the raw horror of war. Battles were a storm of sounds, colors, and smells. a sensory chaos that Geoffrey could not anticipate in all its intensity. Armors clashed against each other. The cruel sound of metal against flesh was muffled only by the screams and moans of the fallen. Moving on the battlefield, Geoffrey fought not only against the enemy, but against his own exhausted body, boiling inside the armor. He learned to fear the battlefield as much as to revere it. On his first campaign, when it was finally time to prove his worth, Geoffrey's feet sank into the muds of northern France on a particularly cold and rainy morning. The ground was a mix of blood and earth, and he could hardly distinguish friends from foes in the whirl of ragged mantles and frayed flags. What he was sold as a glorious dance of war turned out to be an incomprehensible carnage, where each decision was a choice between death and honor. Upon returning from that campaign, Geoffrey was permanently changed, his romantic vision replaced with something much darker. The long hours on horseback also took their toll. Horses, treated as precious assets, always received the best of everything, for without them a knight was nothing. Even so, the long days of march and battle made feats over the saddles exhausting, and Geoffrey would often dismount exhausted, only to sleep in fear of an unexpected attack. The life of a knight was inextricably tied to the service of feudal lords. This meant that much of Geoffrey's time was spent safeguarding the lands and will of a lord he hardly knew. There were continuous land disputes, taxes to be collected, villages to be protected or suppressed as political needs changed. The ancient ideals of chivalry often clashed with harsh political reality, where intrigue and betrayal threatened as much as open battle. Geoffrey also had to deal with the challenges of bravery. In an age where courage was the ultimate proof of a man's character, reckless deeds were disguised as heroism. Many knights would throw themselves into impossible situations, driven more by the desire to rise as legends among their peers than to make sensible judgments. More than once, he saw friends and allies fall in the name of this reckless honor. Disease and death were also always lurking. The tumultuous life of a knight, constantly moving between borders, exposed them to illnesses against which they could do little. Geoffrey, like everyone in his era, feared these small, invisible scourges as much as the enemies he saw. The rumbling of the cart wheels on the steep paths of the crossings contrasted cruelly with the tragic parade of feverish and defenseless knights. And yet, despite all these dissuasions, the ideology of chivalry persisted. Over time, alongside his warrior companions, Geoffrey learned to adapt his gaze to accept frustrations and contradictions. His tales of bravery and sacrifice were not just fables for the fire at night, but they soothed the need to believe that something greater underpinned his acts in the web of history. Geoffrey would continue to be a knight until his final days. He fought for honor, love, and sometimes simply because he knew no other way to be. After decades, with grey hair and his armors lined up as a tribute to days past in his armory, he would reflect on all that had been lost and gained. That child clutching a stick as a sword had become the hardened man, no longer blindly enthusiastic, but definitely wiser. Countless young men followed the same path, wearing heavy armors, carrying the weight of honor, and facing the harsh reality that Geoffrey had faced. And when he finally hung up his sword, the fog once again rose over the fields of Anjou, and the cycle of knights continued. Perhaps Geoffrey found peace in the stories he left behind. Perhaps, like so many before him, he simply learned to accept that not all glory shines at all times. In Geoffrey's story, passed down through the generations, what remains is the truth that being a knight was not a story of endless glory, but rather a path trod by thorns, where courage and resignation met in equal measure. The veil of romanticization was, forever, lifted. The armor was not just physical weight, but a perennial metaphor for the dilemmas and challenges of medieval life. For in the end, the life of a knight was less about the shine of steel and more about surviving under its relentless weight. On a clear and cold morning in the year 1520, Hampton Court Castle radiated a grandeur and wealth few places in England could match. The rising sun kissed the multicolored glass windows, casting red and gold glows over the solid, cold stones of the main hall. Inside, however, there was an unusual bustle. Servants hurriedly ran, their soft leather shoes silenced by the muffled sound of the rich carpets covering the extensive passages. All of this was part of the daily protocol to ensure that the life of the most famous of English kings, Henry VIII, proceeded without a hitch. However, a crucial part of the monarch's routine remained wrapped in a mantle of embarrassing opulence, the daily act of relieving oneself. At that time, the glamour surrounding the courts of European kings often masked a harsh reality. Personal hygiene, even for the highest in the hierarchy, was precarious. The main protagonist of Henry's morning rites was the groom of the stool, a position of prestige and trust held by a man whose calling was to assist the king in his most intimate moments. Singularly named, Thomas Heneage was Henry's current privileged confidant, his personal assistant in matters of the throne. And here, throne takes on a subtly different meaning than what was commonly understood. While the smell of rich steaming stews filled the corridors, announcing the arrival of the morning, the groom of the stool occupied himself with another particular task, preparing a portable trough richly decorated with polished and velvety walnut wood. This pot, despite its beauty, was a bitter reminder of the precarious sanitary conditions of the time. The king's office, through which giant Flemish tapestries extended, housed this secondary throne, a portable nightpot brought directly from the east, shaded by a miniature of Westminster cloister, adorned in gold and silver. Henry, a robust man of imposing figure, was notorious for the meticulous application of etiquette in all aspects of his life. However, it was the shocking simplicity of the hygiene that my Lord Heneage had to oversee, which best illustrates how the refinement of a court spawned strange partnerships between opulence and filth. No one was allowed to enter the room while the morning ritual unfolded. Sweet scents were muffled by dried herbs and incenses as Heneage, dressed in his impeccable brocades, attended the king attentively. This close relationship granted to Heneage not only solidified his importance in court, but also gave him unparalleled influence behind the curtains. He became the repository of Henry's most poignant confidences, secretly feeding his position in a power machine that might otherwise have swallowed him. Going back a few centuries, the setting at the court of Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, shining archetype of absolute monarchy, who lived in the Palace of Versailles, was no less marked by peculiarities in the area of hygienic practices. Versailles, with its symmetrical gardens and endless halls, embodied grandeur, but hid unmistakable faults when it came to sanitation. The palace had no plumbing or adequate sewage, which turned the extraordinary gardens into places where courtiers, stopped by the prolonged demands of continuous presence in the palace, carried out their needs outdoors. It was a spectacle déshabillé, the roaring contredanse between luxury and lack of basic hygiene, lending to the royal daily life an aura of paradox. The king, in his golden splendor, ventured through the day permeated with overwhelming fragrances, aiming to mask the almost tangible presence of unpleasant odors. The magnificent quarters, with dense tapestries and richly carved furniture, witnessed shoes that dragged invisible dirt, while the grand halls echoed stories of banquets and past conspiracies. At that time, hygiene was a neglected territory amid more urgent concerns, such as the endless power games and the intricately elaborate spread of court ceremonies. Baths, when taken, were rare and seen as potentially harmful to health, a line of reasoning that cast long and doubtful shadows. Contrasting with future times where the water revolution would bring plumbing and explicit sanitation to palaces, the kings of past centuries lived enveloped in this singular juxtaposition of grandeur and basic sanitary inability. As they navigated their glorious stone and tapestry domains, they demarcated spaces with a gaze that reached beyond the flames of candles and the sounds of the lute. As the old world moved towards modernity, and the stone blocks of the castles retreated to make room for new industrial cities, a new consciousness slowly emerged around the importance of hygiene. Overlaid by new sanitary solutions, the archaic practices of the kings became almost mythical, reminding us that at some time the subtle odor of old times permeated all spheres of power. The 20th century would bring with it luxurious bathrooms and a reconfigured understanding of the pure and the dirty. The stench and glory of the ancients have never been forgotten. The hygienic reality of kings was imperfect, and the almost fabled memory of contact with the earth gives them a perversely charming human touch. It was the triumph and bankruptcy of monarchs, a dance between the majestic and the mundane, recorded in the annals of history with unmatched rawness. Indeed, as the lights of reason expanded, the shadows of the past lurked, reminding us that even kings are made of flesh. Amid the successive glories remained the visceral simplicity of the human condition. And so, the dance ends, the sublime and repugnant convergence of kings between pomp and foul humanity persist, inextricably intertwined. In Victorian-era London, with its heavy fogs and narrow streets, a new sound arose at dawn, the constant noise of industrial machines tracing their marks on the modern world. On these grey streets, the beauty of the Gothic architecture mixed with the acrid smell of coal smoke, composing a gloomy scene, but full of promises for many. The Industrial Revolution, with its promise of progress and wealth, brought with it a harsh reality for those of small stature and limited strength, the child workers. Imagine little Arthur waking before the sun casts its rays over the horizon. Huddled in a worn-out blanket, he rises from a squeezed mattress on the floor of a damp room. Beside him, sleepy moaning noises from his three brothers mix with the irregular breathing of his mother, exhausted by the long hours of sewing to support the family since the premature death of the father, a worker who succumbed to tuberculosis after years of work in a textile factory. Arthur was putting on his worn boots, the sole already so thin it barely protected his small feet. He wore the same patched-up blouse and vest, his only clothes, before rushing off to the docks where he waited with other boys for the rusted iron gates of the factory to open. Each day, the competition for bread, those trifles given out to the first to arrive, was intense. This effort was the difference between going to bed with a small piece of bread or a rumbling stomach from hunger. The boys, like Arthur, didn't have the luxury of attending school. Instead, their days were dictated by the shrill whistle of factories. The work started before dawn and often went until after the sky darkened. The chimneys still spewed black smoke when the small workers were released, exhausted. Many barely lifted their feet as they walked home, their slate eyes burned from continuous contact with soot and dust. Inside the factories, a hell of iron and steam, the environment was hostile and dangerous. Giant machines boasted belts that spun incessantly, intimidating anyone who approached. For Arthur, the job was to watch over the web of gears, using his small, agile hands to untangle cotton threads that occasionally interrupted the machinery's routine. The task was repetitive and endless, yet required constant attention. A single moment of carelessness could result in severe injuries. Amputations of fingers and limbs were a constant and real threat, demanding its toll mercilessly. The factory floor was always slippery, soaked from the residue of machines and the sweat of bodies working incessantly. Ventilation was minimal, and the walls, imbued with moisture, sweated sadness. The stifling, heavy atmosphere stole every breath from the small lungs. A thin film of cotton fibers hung in the air, an inherent mist that infiltrated the lungs, serving as a ticket to the loyal clientele of charity houses. Young workers with wet cops and blue lips, already marked by the suffocation of a shortened life. Besides textile factories, Arthur could have easily found himself working in coal mines, a fate reserved for many youngsters. In these underground locations, danger was as thick as the coal they extracted. Children crawled through narrow tunnels, transporting the mineral in carts that tested their already scarce strengths. The constant darkness was punctuated only by the faint glow of oil lamps, dancing shadows revealing dirty faces and calloused hands. Despite the adverse conditions, Arthur's comrades were his only allies. It was between whispers and muffled laughter that they found some relief. One such boy, Isaac, a freckled boy a year older, had the gift of mimicking voices and turning routine sentences into jokes that elicited giggles even in front of the vigilant overseer. The moments of lightness were rare and fleeting, like the sight of a rainbow after an intense storm. At mealtimes, the thin soup and piece of bread devoured zealously were more than just food. They were a moment when conversation sprouted, timid and hesitant about the dreams they kept hidden. For many, running through green fields under a mild sun was a surreal desire, almost intangible, a memory of a time they never lived. Arthur, however, in his daydreams, saw himself in a world where he held a pen, tracing letters on paper under daylight, far from the screams of the machines. However, there was no hope for easy escape. Labor laws, protectors only in writing, were often ignored and ineffective. Employers held absolute power, and any insubordination was punished with dismissal or, worse, physical punishment. The rulers, surrounded by luxury and distant from the palpable misery on the streets, closed their eyes to this pandemonium, focused on the riches produced and displayed in the opulent halls of palaces. As terrible as the circumstances were, it was the cruel irony of a time that celebrated innovative inventions and technological advances at the cost of young and innocent lives. And so, Arthur and his companions lived their journeys in a world where the future was uncertain and dreams continually obscured by the macabre sound of machines. With the determination and resilient strength that childhood poverty usually provides, they continued to resist, the thread of hope always as thin as a cotton thread that danced in the gears of their souls. Arthur, like many of his friends, would disappear into the anonymity of history, but their experiences would be the carefully sewn stories of the tragic tapestry of an era. The collective memory that today makes us pause for a moment in the face of the freedom we possess, a reflection on the weight of innocence sacrificed on the altar of progress. And so, the life of these small and courageous workers continued, until the gears of time finally freed them from their burden. The story of the innocents reveals more about suffering than the coldness of statistics. In the confines of Feudensburgo, a forgotten village in the interior of medieval Germany, the sun rose timidly behind an endless cloth of grey clouds. The persistent smell of burning fires with damp wood hung over the village, a constant in the lives of those who lived there. For the inhabitants, dawn was another day of struggles and uncertainties. But for Hans Vollmer, the local executioner, it was another page in an endless book of sins and judgments. Hans woke daily to the sound of cynical crows perched on wooden crosses already twisted by time. His humble hut, located on the outskirts of the village, stood out for being even darker than the others, as if nature itself distanced from the infamy associated with its inhabitant. There, Hans lived alone, his only companion a heavy leather hood he wore to hide his face during executions. At 38 years old, Hans had lost count of the men and women who had met their end by his hands. He inherited the craft from his father, just as his grandfather had done, and thus became part of a lineage that was both feared and indispensable. Vollmer's eyes reflected the weariness of his spirit, a fatigue that wine or promises of penance could never appease. The small village, even more hostile in the winter months, relied on the executioners in two seemingly contradictory ways: by the sinister necessity for justice and by the superstitious belief that the executioner's profession warded off greater evil. Hans Vollmer, however, was not a religious man nor a sadist. He carried out his duty as a family obligation, following the orders of masters and clerics, not God. On the cold morning of the 5th day of that February, the church bell rang insistently. The square was ready for the macabre spectacle that persisted in entertaining, haunting, and correcting. Everything started with the tolling of the bells, a summons both for Hans and the community. Before midday, the stone square would be filled, for the first time in weeks, with peasants and traders, forced by duty or drawn by morbid curiosity. Hans, already dressed and with firm steps, made his way. The villainy of his profession gave him involuntary privileges. He was granted space in the markets, feared in the taverns but rarely confronted. The steps to the scaffold, to him, were like a hallway to the very confirmation of his unwanted trade letter. Arriving at the center, the intense murmuring of the people rose and fell among them like a macabre choir. The torches, even in daylight, lit the wooden stage already worn out by many executions. He inspected the equipment as any conscientious craftsman would. The newly sharpened blade hung there, delicate but threatening, giving him some relief, knowing it would cause less suffering to the head it was meant to meet. The heavy oak block, already quite marked by the stories of the past, was indelible before those who dared to peek. On that particularly cold morning, the village awaited the execution of a young man named Dirk Bauer, accused of thefts ranging from the banal to the shocking, aggravated by instances of violence that resulted in the death of a trader. Dirk, a man of little over 20, was curious because he was loved and hated by many in the village, as sometimes happened with those who challenged the safe norms of society. A cart carried the condemned man to the square, the crowd compressing to get a closer look. Their silent prayers were mostly for divine justice, but some still managed to evoke pity for the young man's youth. Dirk descended lead, his eyes sparkled with determination and disdain. In Hans's sight, here was a boy, not a monster. As he placed him before the scaffold, the mob erupted in cries and pleas, muffled by their own voices, justice or blood, or both. Hans Vollmer was methodical to the extreme, placing the convict in his position almost respectfully. He knew that what awaited him, from the sentence to the last moment, was not the most terrible fate a man should endure. He worked as a sculptor preparing a symbolic statue, his hands steady, his posture reduced by his black cloak which, if seen from afar, made him look like a death's messenger. From time to time, a child tried to sneak between the rows of adults, briefly to watch or understand what they barely knew how to explain. There the executioner confronted Dirk, their gazes meeting only for a moment. In the eyes of the executioner, perhaps merely an exercise in mercy, but for the condemned, a last glimpse of the world beyond. Silence was ordered. The crows fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stagnate. After formal words spoken by the local priest, which culminated in a final visible sentence of forgiveness, the blade fell. The heavy sound echoed like a muffled thunder, and the audience, almost instinctively, recoiled from that sudden death. Vollmer, as usual, remained motionless, a statue against the unfathomable background, while the body was removed. He turned when the murmurs were inflating the dissolution of the crowd, life resuming its mechanical cycle. The executioner, man or demon, carried with him the weight of that moment like countless before him, knowing that his name would remain associated with the last gasp of another. He was the embodiment of justice, a dark talisman that maintained order amidst chaos. In the end, Hans Vollmer disappeared into the mist of the fame of what he needed to perform. The shadow of his profession poured out like ink on the stone floor, marking each step taken under clouds full of unforgettable times. The cycle ended, as many times before, leaving behind only undesirable memories. Justice was swift, but the echoes of the actions eternal. In the records of Feudensburgo, Hans Vollmer remained as a figure of unclaimed necessity, the fragile balance between order and chaos that the centuries would never forget. In the quiet and slightly muffled room, the only illumination came from a few subtly placed candles on antique sideboards. The shadows danced on the walls decorated with faded tapestries and portraits adorned with gold frames. In this setting, in 18th century Vienna, Franz Anton Mesmer glided smoothly in his dark velvet robes that squeaked with every movement. The imposing figure was a renowned doctor, but few could imagine that he would become famous, or rather infamous, for his singular performances and for the creation of one of the most bizarre cures in medical history, based on something he called animal magnetism. Born in 1734, Mesmer showed early on a refined intelligence. He was sensitive to music and art, worlds where harmony and order prevailed, later reflecting his beliefs in the influence of invisible forces on human health. After graduating from the University of Vienna, he initially followed the steps of any diligent doctor, prescribing conventional treatments of his time. But his investigations soon shaped a new course. At the time, medicine was a field of sometimes brutal exploration. The cures involved frequent bloodletting, drastic purges, and diets that actually weakened the sick more than they relieved them. Mesmer, fearless and curious, questioned these methods, seeking a harmony between emotion and physical health, a link that traditional concepts could not explain. Inspired by studies on magnetism applied to moving inanimate objects and by the growing fashion of mesmerism, he believed that something similar could settle bodily disorders. Mesmer's central belief was that an invisible fluid, the universal magnetic fluid, permeated the human body. He believed that this fluid regulated health by balancing internal forces. Diseases were caused by blockages or irregularities in this flow. Mesmer claimed to be able to manipulate this fluid, first by magnets and later through his own hands. His methods were at least theatrical. Patients, often women of the Viennese aristocracy, longing for new and exotic treatments, were placed in carefully prepared rooms where the windows were blocked to eliminate mundane distractions. At the center, elaborate thrones were arranged where the patients sat, or else around a large receptacle known as a baquet, filled with water, glass, metal filings, and, strangely, earth. This mysterious device was wrapped with iron bars and ropes, which the patients squeezed to supposedly channel the magnetic flow through their bodies. Mesmer, with deliberate movements, passed between his clients, smoothly sliding his hands through the air, producing a trance that he claimed was crucial for healing. The moments that followed were of pure collective hypnosis. Some patients writhed, cried, and sometimes laughed uncontrollably. At other times, they fell into a cathartic state, where it was claimed that true restoration of body balance occurred. Mesmer, enveloped in his calculated serenity, spoke in a low and continuously charming tone. He was the orchestrator and conductor of an almost magical spectacle. The impact of this on a culturally effervescent 18th century Vienna was, as expected, immense. Mesmer quickly gained a faithful following of followers and opponents. His practices also attracted attention from royalty, although with different reactions. For example, Mozart, a contemporary, was reportedly inspired by Mesmer's methods when writing Così fan tutte, while Emperor Joseph II showed increasing skepticism. Bitter after being discredited in Vienna and, in part, aiming to expand his horizons, Mesmer left for Paris. There, the capital of enlightenment, the triumphant entrance of the magnetizing doctor caused a sensation. Parisian society, fascinated by scientific novelties and exotic spectacles, initially welcomed him with enthusiasm. Mesmer settled with profitable sponsorships, continuing his experiments in magnetism, now with the support of the Parisian cultural and intellectual elite. It wasn't long before his methods were examined under the scrutiny of science. In 1784, a commission established by the French government, which included names like Benjamin Franklin, was tasked with investigating animal magnetism. The verdict, the result of rigorous experiments, was simple and devastating. There was no scientific evidence to support the existence of a universal magnetic fluid. Mesmer was forced once again to exit the scene, now a discredited man, although his methods found followers for many years, eventually evolving into what we now know as hypnotherapy. He spent the rest of his days in obscurity, occasionally writing about his discoveries, facing rejection by established science. Mesmer passed away in 1815, but the impact of his work, or his spectacle, is rooted in medical history as a reminder of the unexplainable nuances of the human mind. Your ability to transform a simple pseudo-scientific concept into something that resounded healing for many, albeit temporary, and through chilling methods such as convulsions and painful trance states, was an admirable feat in the art of creative deception. When the shadows of night fell upon the treatment room and the last candles went out, all that remained was silence, and the doubt that Mesmer never managed to see answered lingered in the air. The power of belief often trumps truth. In the theatre of the mind, reality sketches itself in the invisible. Salem, Massachusetts, end of the 17th century, a small Puritan town of timber houses perched between dense forests and the cold Atlantic. A perennial fog hovered over the tangled land, bringing an air of mystery and discomfort. The humble huts of the Puritans, with their tiny windows and grey chimneys, were lined up in stoic rows like silent guardians of dark secrets. The dirt roads were often shrouded in a peculiar stillness, interrupted only by the whisper of the wind, or occasionally the distant sound of monks chanting in a nearby chapel. In the winter of 1692, something heinous began to unfold. Snow fell softly on the desolate landscapes, and the sharp cold served as a constant reminder of human frailty in the face of relentless nature. Among the dark huts, small flames crackled, offering comforting warmth that seemed the only protection against unknown external forces. In Reverend Samuel Parris's house, unease began to germinate like a vineyard of madness. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, began to suffer unexplained convulsions. The girl was a disconcerting sight, writhing on the ground like a fish plucked from the river, her eyes injected with a terror that nobody could soothe. Abigail Williams, the Reverend's niece, was soon to follow the same fate, and both quickly caught the attention of the small community. The Puritans had answers to almost everything in the Bible, but these events left them perplexed. When doctors were unable to diagnose the girl's convulsions, the conclusion was as unequivocal as it was terrifying. Witchcraft. Prayers were said, hymns chanted, but the storm had already begun to blow, unearthing unspoken grudges and fears. The climate of paranoia took over the village, and it wasn't long before suspicions fell on residents. Women were the most sensitive to accusations. The pointing finger of social sin easily pointed in their directions, because it was easier at that time to blame the woman, symbol of the original sin of the first stumbling of humanity. Tituba, Reverend Parris's slave, was the first to bear the brunt of this collective delirium. Being a woman and an alien in that society, her dark skin and distinct dialect made her an easy target. The accusing girls, between nervous laughter and trembling fingers, pointed to her as the source of their torments. Captured and dragged to court, Tituba faced the magistrates with her spirit already weary. The men with their coarse faces and hard eyes watched her, as if every word she said was a step towards the abyss. Under interrogation, she confessed, not out of guilt, but out of desperation. She told stories of night flights, hideous parties in the heart of the forest, visions conjured not by magic, but by the need to survive. Tituba's confession was like a spark, igniting a mass hysteria that would sweep Salem in the following months. There were over 200 formal accusations of witchcraft. Women who, until then, led quiet lives, suddenly found themselves in front of the court, their fates in the hands of a jury already convinced of their guilt. Sarah Good, a pregnant beggar with a proud spirit, was another fatal victim. She wandered the streets barefoot, a pale and skinny figure whom other women avoided out of superstition and aversion. Accused by the same girls, she remained steadfast, denying involvement with dark practices, but the evidence at the time were only frightened words and inflamed rumors, testimonies of visions of specters, insinuating voices in the middle of the night. That was enough. Sarah Osborne, a widow who rarely appeared among the congregations due to illness, also had her name tarnished as a practitioner of demonic arts. Unable to appear in court, her absence was interpreted as guilt, a sentence sealed before she could even open her mouth to defend herself. The trials were a cruel theatre, a macabre dance of accusations and sufferings. The sessions were conducted in a strict manner to avoid any semblance of compassion or doubt. Clerks wrote down every word, transforming absences in speech into gaps of truth, capturing on paper the fate of the accused. Martha Corey, respected in her community, believed that the accusations were baseless, a tragic farce. Fearlessly, she expressed her doubts about what she considered a spectacle of fervent insanity. But the act of disagreeing did not go unnoticed in the vigilant eyes of the Puritans. Soon, Martha too found herself in the dock, where her once unwavering faith began to be used against her, painted as an irony of the internal demons. The prison in Salem was overcrowded and stinky. Women filled its cells, whispering prayers in the shadows, or silently crying for the children they did not know if they would ever see again. In a dark corner, Mary Esty awaited her fate with the resignation of a lamb. She, unlike many others, was released after a persuasive testimony, but was soon entangled again by accusations when greed and hatred proved more powerful than reason. The Salem trials were a relentless vortex of rancor and fear. At the fulcrum of all accusations was a silent conspiracy of inequality, where women were more vulnerable than men, and those who dared to stand out from the norm were quickly denounced. Day after day, sentences were decided, the bang of the gavel in the courtroom echoing like the final blow of a justice that, in truth, carried the blindness of dogmas and superstitions. The condemned were led to the gallows on top of Gallows Hill, their skinny, rejected figures lined up against the winter sky, pale faces framed by the icy wind. The ropes, rigid as sleeping snakes, awaited their necks like starving executioners. Giles Corey, husband of Martha, refused to declare himself guilty or innocent, for doing so would imply the expropriation of his land. Choosing silence as a form of resistance, he was crushed to death under a door covered with stones, each one heavier than the last, until his breath gave out under the weight of human wickedness. As time passed, the executions shook Salem. Fear, once a smothering cloak over consciences, began to dissipate in the face of the relentless reality of so many deaths. Troubling questions emerged from the shadows. Were these women truly witches or simply victims of a society eager to punish what it couldn't understand? In October 1692, the hysteria began to lose steam when Governor Phipps, moved by the death of his wife and the intervention of respected intellectuals, forbade new executions and released many prisoners. However, for those who had already gasped their last breath, justice came too late. Salem today is a place of memory, where the wind has blown over years of fear-filled recollections, echoing the screams of innocence prematurely thrust into the unknown. Its history serves as a reminder of what happens when fear overpowers reason, a cautionary tale of the dangers that dwell in the shadows of ignorance and intolerance. And so, in that icy winter, the whispers of Salem were stifled but never forgotten. Because, in the quiet of a cold night, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of these stories, stories of punishments that shape the course of history forever. At the dawn of the 18th century, the treacherous waters of the Caribbean were an infamous stage for those who defied the established order: pirates. Beyond the legends and myths, the reality of pirate life was a cruel dance between freedom and misery, where the wind, diseases, and early death were as constant companions as the roar of the waves against the hull. Picture a cloudy morning, heavy clouds promising a coming storm. The pirates of a ship known as Queen Anne's Revenge awakened to the acrid smell of gunpowder and salt. Under the command of the fearsome Blackbeard, whose penetrating gaze and blackened beard exuded both authority and terror, the crew dragged themselves out of dank, dark bunks. There were no luxury cabins. Most slept wherever they could, on straw or tucked into hanging hammocks, the boards groaning in protest with each harsh movement of the sea. Food was another constant battle. Barrels of biscuits hard as rocks and salted meat were common meals aboard. These supplies were often infested with worms, forcing pirates to shake them off before braving a rough bite. To relieve the sickness of the taste, watered-down rum was poured into chipped mugs as worn out as the faces of the men who held them. Diseases were the universal language in the pirate world, indiscriminate. Scurvy, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, consumed many, causing teeth to rot and bodies to weaken each passing day. Under the gaze of an onboard surgeon, often more barber than doctor, amputations were performed with terrifying regularity, the horror of infection looming as a constant shadow. These men, these lawless rogues, required unspeakable courage to persist under such desolate conditions, far removed from fantasies of glorious adventures. But it was not just penury that overwhelmed the corsairs. Dispensing justice under red or black flags, codes were followed on board, social contracts that governed the ordered anarchy of a pirate's life. In these yellowed and stained sheets, the rules detailed the division of spoils, the rights of the wounded in battle, and even how disagreements should be resolved. There was a certain sense of democracy rare for the time. The captain was often elected by the crew, and if his command did not please them, replacement was swift. A man could rise in the ranks as quickly as a bullet crossing the sea winds, but at any moment a mistake could make him fall, swallowed by the same ocean he once reigned. However, it was not only violence that marked pirate life. The most infamous name in pirate folklore is perhaps that of Blackbeard, or Edward Teach, who knew how to use both force and theatre to his advantage. He intertwined fuses in his beard, lighting them in fights, creating a demonic aura around him, an image that terrified without the need to fire a single bullet. His presence was a terror campaign in itself, deterring many from surrendering without the spilling of blood. The brotherhood that formed on board was unique, born of hardships and rebellion against governments and mercenaries trying to nullify them. The crews were often multiracial, composed of deserters, former slaves, and men wanted for crimes or debts. Pirates offered refuge, a sense of belonging in a world that insisted on pushing them to the margin. Under the banners of a free ship, all were brothers, united not by blood, but by the storms faced, the treasures plundered, and the songs sung to the rhythm of the waves. Trust relationships were essential at sea, where betrayal could surface at any moment between crosses of betrayals and hidden daggers. Except for the frequent spoils and captured ships, the pirates' view of the world was not just about accumulating wealth mindlessly. A fascinating facet was the honesty quotient in the loot sharing. There was an almost equitable division of goods, unprecedented on firm land where inequality prevailed. This distribution reflected the equality sought by many, temporarily transforming a world of greed into a bubble of illogical and warm equity. A pirate's life was paradoxical, where brutality met camaraderie, where chaos was tamed by a bizarre set of rules that spared no captain for breaking them. However, as quickly as they could wield terror in their favor, if they spotted a vastly superior enemy fleet or overly violent gust of wind, instinctive survival turned the promise of combat into desperate flight, hiding among unlikely havens, small islands whose jungles offered safe hideouts, and a freshness never found on the sweltering and bustling city streets. During village invasions, although history manuals tended to create heroes or carry the banner of morality to an extreme, The truth nestled itself in inhospitable locations, immutable by the tide of time. These encounters were not glorious. They were inexorable carnages where screams could be silenced by the harshness of sabers and uncontrollable fire. Amidst the confusion, the clock of destiny was the master of all, and each faithful follower of the Black Flag knew that the gallows awaited them on solid ground. As night fell, after a bloody day or a miraculous escape, songs echoed from the decks. Melodies that spoke of the promised blessings and the dangers faced. The voices intertwined with the wind itself, a symphony of dreams, nightmares, and the eternity of a sea that, despite its vastness and mystery, was the only thing they truly possessed. So under the enormous starry sky that seemed to swallow the horizon, they pondered their fleeting existences, brief shooting stars in the infinite night. In the coming dawn, reality would return with its relentless claws, but for this night, eternity was theirs. Blending reality and legend, survival and torment, pirates lived against time, haunted by evils or caught by the tides of their own choices. That was a life soaked in excess and deprivation, and even when they faced the desire for lasting repose in the eternal waves, life continued like a restless ghost. As relentless as the sea, the pirates were truly fleeting shadows crossing the seas. The reality of pirate life, harsh, brief, and tinged with myths. In the dawn of the 18th century, when the sun rose over the bustling cities of Europe, a splendid and risky fashion theatre unfolded. The streets of Paris became improvised runways, with women and men exhibiting their wealth and status through a kaleidoscope of colors, extravagant fabrics, and luxury accessories. This period was marked not only by sartorial splendor, but also by the way desire for beauty led many to a tragic fate. The voluminous dresses and tight corsets that enhanced the female silhouette symbolized not only social rigidity, but also extreme discomfort and danger. The basis of many of these costumes was made up of crinolines and farthingales, rigid structures usually made of steel or wooden hoops. They kept the skirts in impressive diameters and could be fatal. In 1760s London, there was a peculiar increase in the number of women who, while trying to cross the narrow and congested streets, ended up getting stuck in carriages or pushed into open fires. Their voluminous dresses caught fire quickly, transforming a status symbol into a deadly flame trap. While Parisians paraded through the brightly lit streets and halls, the bright red pigment of their clothes caught anyone's eye who crossed their path. This vibrant tone, obtained through a powder called cinnabar, was highly valued in high society for its intensity and lasting color. Few knew or preferred to ignore that cinnabar was mainly composed of mercury sulfide, a toxic substance that, when handled and absorbed by the skin, slowly poisoned the user, causing tremors, muscle weakness, and eventually painful death. If women's fashion was a deadly spectacle, men's fashion was not far behind in its hidden risks. At the height of extravagance, men adopted the use of elaborate wigs full of powder, accessory of essential importance for any respectable gentleman. Commonly, lead or arsenic powder was used to lighten these wigs. Constant inhalation of these harmful substances caused many to faint, have scalp wounds, and in the long term, suffer from various chronic diseases. Wigs, besides being a fashion statement, were also a pestilence station. Worn for long periods and almost never washed, they were inhabited by all sorts of parasites. An infestation that began in the head quickly spread to collars and laces, providing the perfect environment for lice and other creatures feeding on organic matter. The most horrific scenario, however, was reserved for court ladies. whose complex dress structures did not even allow them to lift their arms. In 1776, in the city of Boston, a young woman named Mary Rawlinson fell victim to this restrictive fashion. During a reception, one of the curtains was set on fire by knocking over a candle. In a matter of seconds, the flames engulfed the swirling dresses around her, including Mary's. The guests tried to run in panic, but the terror and weight of their own clothes immobilized them. Long, curly, and adorned hair was also the target of a lethal vanity. What was not public or widely advertised was how to get the cascades of curls and perfect waves. Perfumed pomades and lotions often contained dangerous compounds. One of the best-kept secrets of the time, especially among the French court ladies, was the use of a special oil derived from a potent narcotic, laudanum. Applied to hairstyles, it gave shine and support to the strands, but in the long term, it caused dependence and hallucinations. The beauty mask that many women applied to their faces had a higher purpose than simple adornment. It hid the marks of smallpox, a cruel disease that decimated populations. However, these masks, made from a mixture of vinegar, lead, and bismuth, were a lethal poison when absorbed by the skin. Lead caused skin discoloration and numerous diseases that often resulted in general body failures and therefore premature death. Perhaps the most insidious element of 18th century clothing was not in the ballroom, but in the small and discreet accessories, the porcelain buttons. In 1785, one of the most prestigious button markets in London attracted the attention of many families seeking the perfect luxury item for their outfits. However, they did not know that the paint that encased the small buttons was often varnished with arsenic, ensuring longevity and shine. When handled daily, these buttons released microparticles of the poison that were slowly absorbed by the skin. The peak of this tragic obsession with aesthetics culminated in a bizarre practice: the use of upholstery in women's dresses with human hair from deceased donors. Fashion merchants sought bodies in morgues or bought directly from the deceased's family. Although this was a more common practice among actors and actresses from renowned theatres, the eventually decaying fashion reached the streets in an almost macabre demonstration of social status. Skirts and dresses increased in extravagance as horror seeped into every point of the seam. The youth and vitality of mortals were no longer enough. Only the icons of death could truly seal absolute glamour. All of this was part of a risky fashion game where those anesthetized by the excesses of luxury barely noticed the sinister shadow that enveloped them. The fleeting beauty they sought every day embraced them with a seductive smile, but left in its wake a silent and inevitable trail of suffering. 17th century. Cruel beauty dictated survival. It extinguished vigors to gain prestige. Death, cold, followed fashion. The sun lazily rose over the vast plains of Mongolia, spreading a yellowish light over the desolated scenery, punctuated by undulating grasslands. The grass seemed infinite, disappearing in the distance, where the horizon kissed the sky. It was easy to lose oneself in the vastness of the landscape, but as the light became stronger, an eerie sight emerged. The horde of horses and warriors composed one of the most feared forces in history, the Mongol army. To understand why someone like you, a modern observer, wouldn't last a day in the Mongol Empire, it is necessary to imagine yourself present at that time, living as one of the many subjects or perhaps captured as a prisoner in the midst of land and kingdom conquests. The Mongols, under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his descendants, dominated vast territories during the 13th century, expanding their borders from Asia to Europe with unprecedented speed and efficacy. The vastness of the territory might be the first challenge for those not used to it. With no large cities to serve as a landmark, the untrained traveler could easily become confused and lost. Survival depended on intimate knowledge of the stars, the wind, and the behavior of wild horses herds. Life was nomadic, as Mongol tribes were not imprisoned by walls or properties. They lived in yurts, wonderful portable tents that could be disassembled and transported as they followed the seasons and pastures. Inside a yurt, in the dead of night, the experienced man or woman could listen to the ghostly music of the winds blowing across the steppe, mixed with the growling of horses. It was a comforting sound for those who knew it, but to a stranger this natural symphony could seem threatening, almost like a warning that these lands belonged to a much larger force. In many ways, Mongol culture was a challenge to everyday survival. Mongols were masters of the bow and cavalry, with men and women training from childhood. They acquired an almost supernatural affinity with their steeds, developing a symbiosis that transformed horse and rider into a single efficient entity in battle and in hunting. The diet, a crucial aspect of life on the steppes, consisted essentially of meat and fermented dairy products. Kumis, an alcoholic beverage made from mare's milk, was not only part of the diet, but also an important cultural element, loaded with symbolic and religious value. An untrained palate would need time that a captured foreigner would never have, to adjust to this heavy and unique nutrition. Going into the Mongol war mode, brutality and cunning stood out. They were known for their innovative and destructive tactics. The favorite strategy was to surround the enemy with a small detachment that simulated retreat. The soldiers then fired lethal arrows from their moving horses, a feat that required years of practice and precision. Survivors of lost battles, captives who escaped immediate death, proceeded on foot on long marches through arid regions without any comforting guarantee of water or food. However, perhaps the most unbearable aspect for someone outside this world was the social and hierarchical structure of the empire. Genghis Khan, a charismatic leader who united the rival Mongol tribes into one people, instituted a meritocratic system, something unprecedented for many enemies accustomed to more rigid feudal hierarchies. The Mongols were intensely loyal to their leaders and had a strict code of honor. Known as the Yasa law, it consisted of precepts, some of which were severely punitive for those who transgressed them. Stealing, deceiving, or killing without orders were actions punishable by death. As aggressive as this set of laws was, it brought a form of unshakable order to the empire, allowing a diversity of cultures and religions to flourish under Mongol rule, as long as they paid tribute. Traders, although they fear, traveled along the silk routes, enjoying the security that the nomad cavaliers offered them, a security difficult to breach and even more to understand in the eyes of foreign contemporaries. Yet even within order, brutality remained inseparable. Conquests were often followed by violent attacks on besieged cities. Anyone who dared resist Mongol rule could be subjected to terrible retributions. In rebellious cities, a large part of the male population was executed, while women and children were distributed as servants and slaves. For foreigners who knew no mercy or defied the laws of the empire, survival in the face of immediate wrathful faces resolved by steel was a scarce probability. On the other hand, an even deeper spectre than military dominion carved the fate of individuals carried into the interior of Mongol lands: cultural adaptability. Mongols often accepted or assimilated useful prisoners, integrating them into their forces or communities. But this did not mean immediate acceptance or easy survival. It was to be always on the edge, facing suspicions and needing to learn a new language, different customs, and mastering the essential skills to live under limitless skies, where the relentless winter and scorching summer dictated the rhythms of existence. This adaptation could be particularly thankless. Assuming a prisoner could withstand the initial military and cultural excesses, the Mongol daily and nightly life continued to offer potential pitfalls. The cold affected the bones, hunger lurked hungrily in nature, and pride, a constant weight on the shoulders of the undervalued, became a steady companion. In practice, the captured foreign visitor would hardly survive beyond the first day. Unable to keep up with the pace of the intrepid Mongol knights, devoid of the stoicism needed to navigate through extremes of landscape and tribulation politics, he could easily collapse, swallowed up by the grandeur of the steppes, reduced to insignificance under the relentless observation of the vast blue sky. Shouts from the harshness of training, the grit of sharpened weapons being forged, and the marching army, a monster of dust and thunder, all this could suddenly disappear. And the traveler, lost, would notice how, in front of the Mongolian steppes, great human endeavors reveal their intrinsic fragility. At nightfall, an ancient silence would envelop the plain. In those cold and arid hours, only the muffled and omnipresent sound vacuum would remain, the simple and eternal presence of the shadows under the silver moon. In the stranger's soul, the void would echo, absorbing any desire to resist, until resignation finally took over, like sands burying a monument long forgotten in time. And so the devastating gears of the empire would continue to turn, indifferent to the brief and ephemeral cradle of any traveler who dared to step, for a day, under its vast skies. As quickly as it began, a life could be obliterated. Such was the reality of a day in the steppes, relentless, as it always was. At the sunset of a bloody twilight, with the sky dyed under a scarlet luminance announcing the imminent arrival of the night, a robust-looking ship sliced through the choppy waters of what we now know as Norway. On that drakkar, with its prow carved with the fierce face of a dragon, were the lords of the sea, men whose names still evoke a mix of fascination and terror. The Vikings. Far from being mere savages, the Vikings were actually skilled traders, formidable warriors, and, as this story tells, merciless human captors. Amid the pillaging along the Scottish coast, a desolate sight occurred. Entire villages were wiped off the map, their humble huts set on fire, while men, women, and children were gathered like herds. This was the fate of Elreds, a young farmer from the now extinct village of Dubgoibneash. On a morning that should have been like any other, Elreds was fishing near the cove. He had just pulled his nets when he spotted a disturbing shadow on the horizon, cutting through the waters in threatening synchrony. Screams broke the morning silence, scorching serenity with hopelessness. He ran in his direction, only to find his house tilting and his family kneeling under the resolute gaze of the barbarians. In the instant of chaos and steel echoing against each other, Aelred's felt his strengths drain as he was subdued, his hands bound with rough ropes that scarified his skin to raw flesh. Carried like a sack of potatoes to the belly of the Viking ship, he barely had time to calm his frantic heart before they set off, his familiar lands disappearing on the horizon. Throughout the crossing, the smell of sea spray was intertwined with the acrid and pungent odor of fear and desperation emanating from the huddled prisoners. Among them, whispers of timid encouragement and comfort were drowned out by the constant hull of the waters against the wood, and the roars of the Vikings echoing above. Aelred's could not help but wonder about what fate would befall him, a frightening thought too terrifying to contemplate for long. Upon reaching the desolate and inhospitable landscape of the north, the prisoners were yanked by their hair, or roughly pushed off the ship. The first sight they encountered was an irredeemably different world, with steep mountains rising over dense forests and glossy black stones glistening under the deceptively delicate sunshine. This was the first glimpse of the land that was to become their new prison. Aelred's was taken to a Viking settlement of high importance, known as Kaupang. Known for its bustling markets and uninterrupted flow of goods from the world over, Kaupang was equally famed for its slave trading, or thralls as they were called. Throughout the frenzy of capture, the young farmer quickly realized that for those brought there by force, this was a grueling and bleak fate. Closely watched, the thralls were stripped of any previous identity and repurchased or sold at the Vikings' whim. Aelred's, with his robust complexion and skill in farming, soon became a valuable asset in the local merchant's human inventory. He was bought by one of the wealthiest chiefs, a man known as Bjorn, famed both for the fear he instilled and the brutal manner in which he treated his subordinates. Establishment on Bjorn's farm was brutal. Under a deceptively bright sun that warmed little if anything, Aelred's was forced to work from dawn till dusk, tilling barren lands or looking after animals that were often treated better than he was. The whips that resonated against the backs of those who faltered served as a constant reminder of their status. There was little margin for error, and the cost of the slightest distraction was invariably pain or deprivation. However, it wasn't the physical brutality that darkened Aelred's spirit further, but rather the deliberate theft of his humanity. Among the Vikings, it was the custom to strip the thralls of any dignity, referring to them only as beasts of burden. Their personal stories, aspirations, and dreams were irrelevant, obliterated in a calculated attempt to erase what made them human. Aelred's wondered if he would ever be able to share his story with anyone who knew how to listen. Winter in the Nordic lands brought merciless cold. Short and harsh nights were a constant battle against the ice penetrating the flesh and bones of the slaves. The precariously insulated huts were more prisons than sanctuaries, and the gruel served did nothing more than emit freezing vapor into the air with every breath taken. It was clear that to survive there, it was not enough to keep the body active. The mind needed to be defended from despair as well. Under such conditions, Aelred's learned to peek at the cracks between fleeting joys and tiny personal victories. One day, for example, he found a wounded raccoon huddled against the unrelenting cold close to where he routinely went to gather firewood. Against all odds, he took care of the animal, feeding it with the little surplus he managed to steal from his own meals. In return, his lonely nights were now divided by the sound of the little animal breathing, a reminder that there was still life and warmth in a world forged in steel and ferocity. Time, always ruthless, passed bitterly. The long years of servitude wore his body down, but Aelred's never lost his desire to regain the lost freedom. Fueled by the stories whispered in the prisoner and laborer camps, rumors of distant places where men could be free, he secretly cultivated the hope of one day escaping that degrading slavery. Historical records from the following centuries agree that the actions of the thralls often contributed to sudden and unexpected revolts, and there was one night in particular that remained etched in memories as the beginning of a rare reprisal. Taking advantage of a kaleidoscopic banquet, where the Vikings were certainly more under the sway of alcohol than on watch. The thralls, driven by an indomitable desire for freedom, united and attacked. With the careful steps of bare feet on leaves dried by the last, guided by a constellation that had for so long been his only confidant, the thralls found a new meaning in life. That night was adorned with possibilities and fear, and even though many of those who sought freedom never lived to remember this feat, that moment held the sweet relief of self-sufficiency. The elucidation of the real history teaches us that the thralls were an integral part of the Scandinavian social fabric, essential in the construction of the Viking societies as much as the stones that built their imposing castles in the sun. Mentions of these fearless men and women are scattered in. And so, for Aelred's and countless others, being a slave to the Vikings became not just an impregnable burden, but rather a sublime stage of determination and bravery. Neither the echo of steel nor the crackling of flames consuming destinies altered an unstoppable. Although popular thinking likes to limit the narrative of these times to a dispute between good and evil, reality has always been infinitely more complex. In the wake of a new dawn, under the incandescent glow of unexpected freedom, Aelred's. The night silences, but the whispers of freedom persist.